For today, I'll be discussing the requirements for IT support of personal services in the digital age. This study is written by Michael Fellmann, Fabian Lambusch, Berger Lantow, and Gregor Simon. So, just an outline of the report. So, first, we have an introduction. So, this is just a quick look at digitalization and the goal of the study. Then we look at the background of the study to establish common knowledge. Then we look at the methodological consideration, where the research process underlying this work is explained in more detail. And then in the derivation of requirements, we will discuss in detail the different methods used. And then lastly, we will discuss the requirements consolidation. So again, digitalization. Even though this topic is far from new, it hasn't lost any of its relevance and is still challenging businesses of all sizes to take the next step. Why? Because digitalization is intrinsically linked to technology, and technology is constantly changing and improving. Digitalization is more than just a buzzword. It's an evolution in the way we work and result in profound changes in what business as usual looks like. Information and communication technologies have become an integral part of everyday life and lead to changes in many areas of work. Two fundamental aspects of digitalization are the transformation of analogously stored information into digital data and the execution of more and more processes by machines or intelligent IT systems. I won't discuss this in depth because it was already discussed in the previous reports. Uh, so the central task for the future will be to develop concepts for digital change that support not only industries with highly structured processes, but also economic sectors with knowledge intensive and weakly structured processes, especially for work with a high degree of uncertainty, like personal services. Due to the special characteristics and the increasing importance of personal services, innovative ideas and sustainable advancement are needed for the digital change in the industry. A major challenge is to determine how services that are primarily characterized by the interactive work of individuals can be meaningful, supported by IT systems. Therefore, it is very important to investigate what the specific requirements that originate from the domain of personal services. So, the main goal of the literature of Fellman and others is to investigate such requirements in a systematic way in order to provide guidelines for the design of valuable IT systems. Background. Let's first establish some common understanding. A business organization produces and offers goods and services in order to earn profit, as well as to fulfill the needs and desires of consumers. We are all familiar with goods. Goods are tangible products that can be seen, touched, and are capable of being delivered to a buyer. Personal services, on the other hand, are those intangible activities that provide satisfaction of wants and imply an interaction to be realized between the service provider and the consumer. For example, treatment by a doctor. Services have unique features which make them different from goods. Some of the features are intangibility. So, services are intangible, that is, they cannot be seen, tasted, felt, heard, or smelt before they are consumed like goods. They are experienced in nature. One cannot taste a doctor's treatment and can only experience it. The second important characteristic of services is inconsistency. The provision of services includes a large measure of human element. In this case, a service provider may alter its offering according to the needs of customers. For example, a doctor treats his patients according to their specific health problems. Inseparability. Another important characteristic of services is that the service provision is inseparable from the service consumption. For example, taxi operator drives the car and then the passenger uses it. The presence of the taxi driver is essential to provide the service. The service cannot be produced now for consumption at the later stage or time. So it's inventory less. So it is perishable and cannot be stored for future use. So service providers can store some associated goods, but not the service itself. For example, railway ticket. So a railway ticket can be stored, but the railway journey or MRT journey will be experienced only when the railway provides it. Right. Lastly, involvement. So the other important feature of services is the participation of the customer in the service delivery process. A customer may get modified services according to specific requirements. So this study focuses on the personal services. So the service sector is gaining more and more importance, although the economic crisis became visible in the service sector of the European Union through a short term decline in the number of employees. The development of employment in services has shown a mostly steady increase even after the two last decades. So, this trend illustrates the importance of addressing the specific challenges and resulting requirements of the growing service sector more comprehensively. Um, A great challenge of personal services lies in the fact that the recipient of the service is at the same time in the role of a co producer. So, personal services are characterized particularly by the close, indissoluble connection between persons who must interact with each other. This interaction, as a key element in personal services, reduces the predictability and increases the uncertainty in the corresponding work processes. Searching for the standard process model, such as reference model, seemingly does not exist in the domain of personal services. However, Flies et al. Describe a straightforward service model that we refer to instead. So, at its cores, the model consists of three phases. So, we have pre service, service, and post service. So, pre service describes the preparation of the service, while while the service is the actual provision of the services, and it includes the interaction with the customer. And the post service refers to the follow up activities. So the author of this literature extend this model with two additional phases. So the client intake and the, what do you call this, the coordination. So yeah, from the point of view of information processing, the registration of a client as the starting point of the relation between customer and service provider is also important. This is where the first information about the client becomes available. So therefore, the phase of client intake is added. So moreover, personal services are often integrated into a longer term process, which then also has longer term objectives. The phases of direct short term service provision may be intertwined with overarching coordination tasks to achieve objectives. Therefore, the phase of coordination was added. So, using the social services as an example, the case is to provide support for a child who refuses to go to school. So, first, the service provider or a social worker was informed about the problem and the family situation, probably by telephone. So, this can be assigned to the phase of client intake. And then in the pre service phase, the service provider or social worker prepares for the consultation. And then during the service itself, a conversation takes place with the child and the parents. And subsequently, the documentation of the contents, duration, and billing information is carried out in the post service phase. So, since we refer to knowledge intensive personal services, requirements for knowledge intensive business processes are relevant for these investigations. So, while routine tasks often can already be automated by workflow management systems or at least supported by IT, it is a major challenge to sensibly support knowledge intensive work with the help of IT. So, for example, we already have like standard workflow management system. For example, in banking, since they have a defined workflow or processes already, it is easy to implement an IT system. So, however, since the personal services they are unstructured in nature, so there's no really framework, there's no really standard SOPs, so it's really challenging to come up with the IT services or IT support um, system. So generally, for Manbrot and Racher, derive 25 requirements of IT support for knowledge intensive business processes. So these requirements are met by the adaptive case management or ACM. So ACM, it's a paradigm which is currently, I think, the most prominent approach to the management and IT support of knowledge intensive business. So, ACM solutions provide functionalities that might fit the requirements of the domain of personal services. Okay, since the goal is to specifically identify requirements for a potential IT support for personal services, the focus is on the functional requirements. So, what are functional requirements? So, functional requirements addresses the features and functions of the software. For example, the number of supported file formats or reports provided. And then requirements regarding aspects of quality or security, they are referred to as non-functional requirements. We will discuss this in the next couple of slides. In order to identify requirements for IT support, the authors of the literature use three different survey instruments. So they have the workshop, expert interviews, and shadowing. So the use of different methods, also referred to as the method triangulation, and the combination of different data sources, also referred to as the data triangulation. So it has the decisive advantage from that shortcomings of individual methods or singular data sources can be compensated. This approach is also described in literature as a systematic triangulation of perspectives, which is characterized by a combination of different perspectives with the result of methodological access s- to the data in its diversity. So in the workshop, so the authors conducted conducted it with different stakeholders from enterprises in the social sector, and then the companies predominantly offer consulting to families. For example, if children show an unwanted or even malicious social behavior or refuse to go to school, or if there are severe conflicts between family members or problems related to misuse of drugs or etc. Different participants contributed their expertise and their individual expectations of the IT support. So, to document the results and suggestions, um, a mind map was used, so from which requirements were derived. And then the workshops were carried out as part of a collaboration, so between University of Rostock and various interested social enterprises from the Rostock area. By the way, the University of Rostock, it's a public university located in Rostock, Germany. And then it was founded in 1419. It is the third oldest university in Germany. Um, so yeah, so it's a collaboration between the University of Rostock and social worker from other social enterprises. So the overall goal of the workshop was to identify how improved IT support could be possible for practitioners working in a personal service industry. So in order to document the results obtained, a mind map was developed and continuously improved throughout the various meetings. As usual, mind mapping, so the findings and considerations were reproduced in a networked structure with many small branches, which continuously increase the level of detail. So we know how to create I think we all know how to create the mind mapping or a mind map in that case. So here, the mind map was then used to derive the requirements, whereby the top level branches of the mind map were translated to high level requirements of IT support. The derived requirements can be found in this table. So this is just a snapshot. I didn't copy everything. So here, they named it as so this code is really important when we consolidate all the requirements. So for this workshop, the output of this workshop requirements, they named it as WRE, and then they listed all the requirements that was produced or gathered in the workshop, and then they provide like an explanation of this requirement, of a specific requirement. So the second survey method represents the expert interviews. The basic aim of the interviews was to develop an understanding of the work performed by the interview partners. For the selection of the questions, it was crucial that a good insight into the variety of the activities was made possible while also acquiring an overview of all activities. Thus, the interview guidance aimed at a balance between the required depth of detail for understanding process instances and their respective specifics, and then the necessary overview in order to be able to derive general requirements that touch from specific consideration. Um, Guided expert interviews were conducted for practical requirement elicitation. So, in these interviews, the expert described their view on the process of personal social services. For the selection of experts, their activities in personal services were the central criterion. Their specialist knowledge and their practical experience from everyday working life, including their knowledge of internal processes, should ensure meaningful answers. So, all in all, so six in depth interviews have been conducted with experts with a broad spectrum of professional experience and know how. to derive the requirements from the interviews, they transcribed it, and then followed by a qualitative content analysis of the transcripts. So this table describe or illustrates the derived requirements, and then in here they sorted it by categories. So and then again, this specific requirements from expert interviews, they named it as IRE. And then IRE 1, 2, 3, etc. Those are categories. And under that categories, they have different set of requirements. And again, it's a must that they have a detailed explanation of what the requirements is. Shadowing or observation is the third method that has been applied to gather requirements. So, more precisely, field observation was used within this work. So, this is essentially based on the notion that the observer documents the activities and work processes of the observed. This is a complementary elicitation method that has been used to develop a more in depth understanding of the work done. The persons observed are essentially those who have already been interviewed, supplemented by the group of people present in the particular situation and interacting with the observed person. So the aspects considered essential to the observer were simultaneously noted in their respective situations or completed as a memory protocol in a timely manner at the end. So the requirements derived from the documentation are shown in this table. So again, they name it as SRE, and here are the requirements, specific requirements, and then the corresponding explanation of each. To develop a holistic system model, the various requirements of the three survey methods were finally brought together or consolidated. And for this purpose, a catalog of requirements was developed which combines and structures the results of the various survey techniques. And then, based on this consolidated requirements catalog, requirements are further analyzed regarding their specificity to social care as a subdomain of personal services and the possibility of mapping them to general system approaches in the domain of knowledge intensive business processes. Additionally, a general classification of the requirements is provided. The author's category system for the requirements contains the following labels. So we already discussed this in the previous slide. So we have client intake, pre-service, service, post-service, and coordination. So these are the phases again. So, in addition to these phase specific requirements for IT support in personal social services, there are also general requirements for corresponding IT systems resulting from the specific characteristic of the service processes under consideration. So, this can be subsumed under general requirements. So, they are mainly the result of the evaluation of the workshop. This slide and the succeeding slides show the requirement catalog where the origins of the consolidated requirements are listed in the rightmost column. So here it's just basically um, it's basically the catalog. So it aggregated and consolidated all the requirements from the workshop, the interviews, and shadowing. So, like in the phase of client intake, so the cases created in the IT system and relevant information recorded. So, under this client intake, these are the requirements, and then these are the origins. So, remember, we have we named the requirements are IRE. So, IRE is from the requirements from the interviews. So SRE, these are requirements from shadowing, and then we don't have WRE here, but it's for the workshop. Anyway, So this is just showing again. So for the phase of pre-service, so here, so after we inform the social worker about the problems, um, she or he will then prepare for the appointment, and as part of that appointment it has like different steps like gathering client information. So the IT support or the IT support system, prospective system, it will have this like, or it needs to address the following requirements, and then again this is the origin of that requirements. So in the service itself, so the actual interaction between the client and the social worker in this case. So we have like just two different requirements for that because it's an actual service. So I don't think they have like a specific workflow that IT can support. And then post service, so after the service, or and after the appointment has been done, and then the client, or sorry, the social worker is done with the consultation. So these requirements were listed again, and then here, like what I mentioned in the previous slide, so the IT proposed or IT support system, it should address the following requirements. And then to map it out again, it is here the origin of that requirement. And lastly, coordination. So here, since it's not really like the post service is not the final step, you need to constantly update the patient or client what's happening. So the IT support system should be able to support the following requirements also. So, requirements are handled differently in systems development depending on their type. So, there are functional requirements, again, so it describe the behavioral aspects of the system. They can be described in terms of possible inputs and desired outputs. And um, we need to map the activities in service processes, and um, because activities can be described in the same way. So, yeah. And then there are also requirements regarding the data itself, the performance, the constraints, and software quality. So it falls under the non-functional requirements. So being diverse and sometimes not clearly distinguishable. So these requirements types are commonly subsumed, like not really a function, subsumed as a non-functional requirement. So we start with the functional requirements and their relation to functionalities of general system types in the domain of knowledge intensive processes. So if we look into the knowledge management system approaches, there is a broad consensus on the general functionalities and these systems should provide. So table 7.5, is a contingency table that maps these functionality areas to the phases of service provision based on the aggregated requirements developed. So the first column contains the functionality areas. So we have access, personalization, knowledge discovery, and knowledge publication, collaboration, and e-learning. The following columns are the count of the requirements that can be matched to the functionality areas or the extended phases. So, client intake, pre service, service, post service, collaboration. And so um, the table shows that there are no requirements formulated regarding personal e learning. So, here we don't see anything here. Um, In case of personalization also, there's nothing in here. So a possible explanation is the little experience of the study participants with enterprise information systems. So far, they only use an information system for the documentation and billing and performed work that shows a good personalization. So nothing really in personalization in e-learning. Furthermore, it can be seen that getting access to knowledge and discovery of appropriate knowledge play a role in the first service phases, including the actual service provision. And then the knowledge publication, so meaning the capture of new knowledge, needs functional support in the phases client intake, pre-services, post-services collaboration. And then for the collaboration, so it is needed in pre-service, post-service, and coordination. Coordination, so because multiple employees are involved in the service provision at the same time or at a different service encounters. The involvement of multiple actors is a common characteristic of knowledge intensive work processes and not necessarily specific to social care. Uh, Overall, knowledge management systems seem to address the requirements of personal services. Application potential lies in the discovery of the access to relevant knowledge in the early service phases, including the actual service provision, as well as in the capture of knowledge before and after provision. And then collaboration functionalities are important if multiple actors are involved in the service provision. However, knowledge management systems do not cover all functional requirements formulated. Besides family care specific functionalities, there are also functionalities needed for process workflow management. The coordination and control of task provision is an important issue considering knowledge intensive process. Um, there are classical workflow management functionalities, so namely definition, execution, and control of workflows. Approaches to workflow management have been developed that addresses the special requirements of knowledge-intensive work processes. So ACM or adaptive case management is the most prominent of these approaches. And then this table 7.6 here, it's a contingency table that maps the functional requirements to general workflow management functionality and ACM, which add runtime adaptability as a main functional area. So since ACM subsumes classical workflow management functionalities, the table row containing the ACM mapping can serve for overall evaluation. Workflow management functionality is required in all phases except the actual service provision. So you will see here, except for this service. So naturally, a strong correlation lies in the coordination of work in and between processes instances, an important finding in the high relevance of ACM functionality in the general system requirements. So, in conclusion, with regard to functional requirements, it can be stated that the required IT functionality in the domain of personal service can be provided by knowledge management systems and workflow management systems like ACM. So this table is just an overview of the findings with regard to functional requirements. So again, potential for IT support is seen mainly in the phases before and after service provision. So before and after. Working on a certain processes instant of client respectively generally requires knowledge management functionalities. So the focus of an IT solution that supports personal services on company level should be on workflow management that implements ACM functionalities. An integration of both would be achievable with solutions that incorporate the data centricity principle of ACM, combining the process instance knowledge with automated process execution support. However, finding method supporting that will support or finding method that support this approach is very challenging. So the non-functional requirements. So considering non-functional requirements, there are two types of requirements present in the collected data. So we have the system quality requirements and requirements regarding the data that needs to be handled by the IT system. So this table 7.8 shows the distribution of non-functional requirements along with the phases of service provision again. So looking at the distribution of information model requirements, it is a straightforward that the definition of information objects, sorry, yeah, it's a straightforward that the definition of information object is related to the knowledge intensive task and thus the phases of the service provision that require support knowledge management system. And then for system quality, requirements can be tracked down to interoperability, which is important in the client intake and pre-service. So, in order to allow the inclusion of different information sources for knowledge discovery. Furthermore, flexible expandability as a general system requirement can be decomposed to adaptability and interoperability. So this is a very broad and coarse-grained definition of requirements. However, in qualitative view, it can be concluded that interoperability is seen as an important feature of systems for the support of personal services. The reason lies in the great number of sources for personal data that are available. Adaptability is a central feature required for performing knowledge intensive work processes, but also very important in personal services. Okay, so just like a key takeaway here. So digitalization is among the most discussed topics nowadays. So, however, it remains unclear how to improve IT support. It's unclear how we should it should be designed in domains with less structured processes, such as in personal services. So far, there are little IT support implemented in the domain of personal services. In order to achieve the goal of a better IT integration in course of digitalization, we cannot rely on past experiences of domain-specific IT support. However, the literature wants us to focus first in collecting requirements in a systematic way in order to provide guidelines for the design of appropriate IT systems. Um, I think that's it. Thank you.